Hey everyone, and welcome back to The Explainer. Today, we're jumping right into something I find absolutely fascinating, a highly specific yet incredibly relatable psychological profile. We're going to unpack this dynamic known as the disciplined fire, specifically looking at it through the classic placement of Mars in the sixth house. Now, whether you study psychological archetypes, you're into astrology, or you just really love understanding human behavior, this explainer is going to reveal exactly how raw, fiery drive gets funneled into the mundane, everyday tasks of our lives. We're talking about what actually happens when an unstoppable energy meets the rigid structures of the real world.
Suppressed frustration turns into inner tension. Just let that sit for a second. This quote right here instantly sets the tone for everything we're about to dive into. We usually think of fiery energy or frustration as something explosive, right? Like a volcano erupting. But the source material points to a completely different reality for this specific profile. When drive and frustration are suppressed, they don't just magically disappear. They fold inward. They turn into this heavy, vibrating inner tension, and that is the absolute core dynamic we're going to be unpacking today.
So, here is our roadmap based on the source. We're covering the concept of disciplined fire, then the engine of urgency, friction and indirect conflict, the physical pressure cooker, and we'll wrap up with channeling anger into structure. All right, let's jump straight into part one, the concept of disciplined fire. Mars in the sixth house is all about drive, but it's drive expressed specifically through work, routine, problem solving, and conflict in everyday environments. Traditionally, the Mars archetype represents raw, fiery energy, war, forward momentum, that kind of thing. But the sixth house? That represents the exact opposite in a lot of ways. It's the realm of daily chores, basic routines, your employment, just the mundane structures of life. So the really crucial point here is that this traditional aggressive fire energy is being channeled into controlled daily effort. It isn't some outward explosion on a battlefield. It's this intense, burning focus directed entirely at getting the daily work done. Basically, it's the fire that powers the factory rather than the fire that burns the forest down.
Which brings us to part two, the engine of urgency.
Take a look at these three traits. Our source points out this constant internal urgency, even for completely ordinary tasks. There is this remarkably high work drive, to the point where simply sitting still physically feels uncomfortable. And honestly, perhaps the most fascinating part is the highly competitive mindset applied to totally routine work. If you have this profile, or you know someone who does, you know exactly what I'm talking about. Folding laundry isn't just a chore, right? It's a time trial event. Commuting to work is this high-stakes competition against the GPS arrival time. Even without any external pressure from a boss or a looming deadline, the internal motor is literally always running at top speed. It's an incredible source of productivity, for sure, but it means the baseline operating speed is permanently set to urgent.
And because that internal motor is revving so fast, we hit this very sharp reality, a deep sensitivity to inefficiency and incompetence. I mean, just imagine the internal alarm bells that start going off for this person when they're stuck behind someone walking slowly down a hallway, or watching a coworker take twice as long to do a perfectly simple task. The source notes that this profile reacts so strongly, whether they show it on the outside or just kind of boil on the inside, to disorder, delays, or just plain carelessness. To a disciplined fire, inefficiency isn't just a minor annoyance. It feels like a roadblock thrown directly in front of a speeding train. But what happens when that speeding train actually hits the roadblock? Let's explore that in part three, friction and indirect conflict. The math here is super simple, but man, is it impactful. Blocked action equals accumulated internal irritation. When the drive to get things done meets an immovable obstacle, say a delayed project, an uncooperative system, or literally just the limits of the physical world, that energy doesn't evaporate. Because this is a placement of controlled routine rather than wild expression, the inability to act immediately causes frustration to pool and build up inside. It's exactly like putting a cork in a boiling kettle. The heat has nowhere to go, so the pressure just mounts. And this brilliantly illustrates how that pressure eventually leaks out. Notice the stark contrast. Over on the left, we've got open confrontation, yelling, screaming, explosive arguments. But actually, scratch that, because that is not the typical style of the disciplined fire. Instead, look at the right side. The source reveals that tension shows up through sarcasm, withdrawal, or passive resistance. It's this sideways expression of anger. Because the energy is meant to be controlled and dutiful, outright rebellion just feels wrong to them. So instead, the conflict becomes indirect. It's the cutting remark in a morning meeting, the sudden icy silence, or just a really subtle refusal to cooperate. It's a fascinating defense mechanism, really, keeping the routine intact while still letting a little bit of the steam escape. Over time, though, carrying that much steam around has a very real cost.
And that real cost leads us to part 4, the physical pressure cooker. I want to ask you this directly, based on what we've covered so far. What do you think actually happens to a human body when the fire is constantly blocked? When the drive to move and work and conquer is continuously pushed down into this simmering, sarcastic internal tension? We aren't just talking about a bad mood anymore. We are talking about biology.
The source is remarkably clear on the physical toll here. It manifests as muscular tightness, profound restlessness, deep fatigue. When frustration isn't released constructively, it literally lodges itself in the muscles. The shoulders start creeping up toward the ears, the jaw clenches. The restlessness comes from the body practically screaming to take action, while the mind just holds it back. And the fatigue? Well, it takes an enormous amount of calories and mental energy to keep an active volcano suppressed all day long. This physical stress is a direct, measurable symptom of unexpressed drive.
So how in the world does this profile cope? Well, here we see a fascinating, almost paradoxical mechanism. On one side, we have overworking. On the other, burning off emotional pressure. The source explicitly states that productivity actually becomes the way to burn off the stress. When this person is angry, irritated, or stressed out, they don't necessarily take a nap or go to a spa. No, they clean the entire house. They stay at the office until midnight reorganizing spreadsheets. Extreme overwork becomes the release valve. They are quite literally trying to sweat out their emotional frustration through sheer productivity.
But hidden inside this intense pressure cooker is a genuine superpower. Hyperfocus replaces panic. When things go completely wrong, when a system totally breaks, a crisis hits, or everyone else in the room is losing their minds, this specific profile suddenly drops right into the zone. That intense internal pressure they carry around every single day suddenly has a perfectly valid external target. Under extreme pressure, they don't panic. They become masterful problem solvers. The internal urgency finally matches the external environment. It is a brilliant and highly effective survival mechanism. Which brings us to the final piece of the puzzle, part 5, channeling anger into structure. The source identifies that learning to actually channel this energy is the ultimate growth path. Step 1 is just acknowledging the internal motor. You have to know it's there. Step 2 is building structure, because remember, raw fire destroys, but fire contained inside a furnace, that powers a city. And step 3 is disciplined effort and endurance, turning that daily irritation into lifelong mastery. And that brings us to our final thought for today. Are you letting your routines burn you out, or are you using your fire to build? Whether you strictly align with this Mars in the 6th house profile, or you just recognize a bit of this disciplined fire in your own work habits, this is the absolute core takeaway. That internal urgency, that deep frustration with inefficiency, it's not a flaw, it's fuel. The goal isn't to somehow put the fire out. The goal is to build a structure strong enough to hold it. Thank you so much for joining me on this deep dive. Keep questioning, keep building those structures, and I'll see you on the next explainer.